So my name is Felix Candelaria. I am a leader with One Love Ministries, and I'm just going to share a little bit about what God's done in my life. So my life began in Puerto Rico. I was born in Puerto Rico, and my father joined the military shortly after I was born. I vaguely remember my younger years, very fuzzy, but I think my memory really begins around sixth grade. We were in Germany. Things were tumultuous in my home, and my father wasn't around as much as he should have been. But that was just the beginning of things that were to come. I was 12 years old at this point, and this is when we moved to Hawaii. We were going to church in Hawaii for the entire time that I was there. And I wasn't really connected to God at first. It wasn't until later on that I encountered God. But I did find my identity in sports. Middle school years were filled with sports and athletics. The beginning of my high school years in Hawaii, 9th and 10th grade, were also filled with the same. It was athletics, it was football, it was soccer, it was anything I could get a hold on or a hold of. But around the age of 15, I was becoming a young man, and it was around that time that I decided to stand up to my dad for, some of his abusive nature and the alcoholism that we dealt with, and it didn't turn out so well. It really turned things inside out in my home, and that's when I personally began to unravel as well. Almost everything that I came across, any problems, I resolved fighting. Fighting was something that dominated my life at that time. Everything was answered with fighting. And as much as my mom tried to get me to church and tried to pull me in, there was some way that I was always finding myself in trouble in this way. But thankfully, there was one family that I did meet around my freshman year in high school. I did meet them. They went to church with myself, with my family, my mom, myself, and it was the Villahermosa family. And through them, I got a little bit more connected to God my sophomore year in high school. That's when I really began to experience God. Even though I was still in this troubled nature and I was still in these troubled waters, I was beginning to experience God and find community in God and find community in church. Spending time with them and going to their church. They had a massive youth ministry. So that really brought me in. They had the sports, they had, the youth building, there were events, and we got a chance to fellowship and spend time together. So that allowed me to see a different aspect of church and a different aspect of God that wasn't revolved around my mom's identity. So I really began to experience God in a different way. So at the age of 16, we were leaving Hawaii. My dad received a change of station, duty station. For any of you guys that have spent time in military families, you know that this is a 3 to 4 year process, sometimes even less. I was immensely attached to Hawaii. I'm an island boy. I was born in Puerto Rico. This was my dad's second tour in Hawaii. So at this point, I had spent almost 8 of my first 16 years of life in Hawaii, between Hawaii and Puerto Rico. So I was extremely attached, and leaving Hawaii almost felt to me like a part of myself had died. We were sent to North Carolina. So I went from the beautiful tropical weather to North Carolina. North Carolina is a beautiful state, but it is not Hawaii. I spent most of my junior year in a pretty severe state of depression. I stopped playing sports, and as I shared, sports was something that was really important to me, and I stopped my junior year in high school. I did nothing but go to school and lock myself in my room. And that dominated most of my junior year. I never played sports again in high school. My senior year, I did get involved in church. My parents, my mom and my dad were going to church together at this time because my mom is a God-fearing woman. She has always been. So she took me to church no matter how much I fought it. She woke me up on Sundays. On Wednesday evenings, if I wasn't playing sports, I was at church. So my mom always took me to church with her. And I did go to church, and things were good. Things were good for a while. But things between my dad and I just never got better. And here I am, my senior year in high school. I was involved with a girl that had me going in the wrong direction. My emotions, adolescence, puberty, all of these chemicals were all interacting at once. And the relationship between my dad and I just came to a head. And right after my graduation, I remember it was the summer of '94. Right after my graduation, my father and I got into an argument in my bedroom. in their house. And I couldn't even tell you what the argument was about. I remember my grandmother was there, my mom's there, my dad's there, and it got so out of control, I ended up putting my fist through the wall, through a door, putting my head through the wall. A complete blow up. And ended up to the point where my grandmother bought me a plane ticket. I spent the rest of the summer in Puerto Rico. When I came back, my dad and my parents made an attempt at trying to make amends with me and sent me off to college. I thought that I was going to be a college student. I did live on campus for 2 semesters, but I was the furthest thing from a college student. I did what everyone does. I went, I partied, I had fun. Drugs, alcohol dominated my life. That's all it was. Once that adventure ended, once that money ran out after 2 semesters, I had to figure something out. I wasn't going back home, so I couch surfed for months at a time. I don't even remember how many months it was that I couch surfed, but it was partying and drugs and making money where I could and couch surfing. And then eventually I met a friend and I settled down. And that lasted for about 6 months until I met a different group of people. Well, this group of people happened to be some drug dealers. And instead of going to school and becoming a better person, I ended up supplying the college campus with drugs for about a year. And that was the group that I was with, and that's how I made my money for about a year. During this time frame is when I met a girl. And this girl and I were together for quite some time, and we ended up conceiving a child in February of '97. And of course, at that point was when I realized I probably need to make some changes. So I began to make some changes to become a little bit more of a responsible person. But I was on my own because she didn't want that same responsibility. And she wasn't going to have my child. That was the story at that time. She had made her mind up that she wasn't ready to be a parent. And I had to suck it up. I had no choice in the matter. And I remember showing up at her home one day after we had gone to a wedding. And I begged her to have the child. And she was having a party at her home. And all kinds of friends were there and friends that we had together, mutual friends. And everyone was drinking and having a good time, and all I did was embarrass myself. I showed up to be embarrassed in front of friends, in front of her, and in front of neighbors, because that was it. That was the end of the story. She wasn't going to have my child. And I was devastated. I didn't know what to do. So I turned to my old friends from Hawaii, the Villahermosa family in Virginia, and I reached out to them, and I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I have nowhere to go. If I don't do something, I'm going to end up destroying my life. But they accepted me and they took me in. And I went up there and I stayed with them for what was about 5 to 6 months. They helped me get myself together. I was going to church again with them. I was finding community like I did, with them in Hawaii, and things were turning around. I was beginning to find myself. And then boom, I get a phone call from my mom. This may be 5 months later. My mom calls me, and my mom's in Puerto Rico visiting family. And she calls me to tell me that my neighbor across the street has a letter in her hand from Lori, who was my girlfriend, and she has decided to keep the baby. And she left that letter at my parents' house. My neighbor saw it, called my mom. So after I had established myself, found a job, set myself back up, and I was moving forward, I had to pick myself up and come back down to North Carolina to try to figure out how I was going to be a father after I had just convinced myself for 5 months, 6 months that I wasn't going to be one. And I did stay with my parents for a short time. This was the only time I stayed with them after leaving in '94 after graduating. And I ended up enrolling in the NC School of Telecommunications. That was my father's gift to me at that time to try to help me get myself together. And it worked, at least it worked for me. I ended up getting some certifications in telecommunications. Lori and I did end up getting back together. We had moved in together. We were going to have a family together. There were engagement rings and wedding rings bought. There were wedding plans made, and I couldn't even tell you what happened. Just 1 year, 2 years went by, and somehow I was right back in the same predicament where it wasn't working out. She didn't want to be with me. I don't know if it was parental influence, family, what it was. I don't know. But what I do know is that one day I show up, and everything was gone. She moved out, she took my daughter, and she left with her parents to Georgia. That set me off on a downward spiral that lasted a few years. I remember that I walked into my apartment, everything was gone, and I didn't walk out of my apartment, I don't think, but twice for the next 2 weeks. And each time I left was to pick up more alcohol and more drugs. I had a good paying job. I had a responsible adult job, but I was completely broken. And I locked myself in my apartment for 2 weeks. I don't even know how many people came by, how many people called. I wouldn't answer the door. My parents came by, and that's where I was. And I remember that I had a boss at that time, and I'll never forget, I even looked him up in preparation for my testimony, because it's important what he did for me at that time. And my best friend knows who he is too. But Tom pulled me in and he shared a story with me about a same predicament that I was in, he was in himself. His wife had left him, taken his kids, and she was living with another man. And he told me, you have to pick yourself up. You have to keep going. You need to come to work. We want you here. We need you here. And I was able to pick myself up, at least maybe a fifth of myself, a quarter of myself, but it was enough to get to work. It was enough to get to work and continue to make money and continue to try to make a living. But at night, it was alcohol and drugs. On the weekends, it was alcohol and drugs. A few months passed by and I was able to move out. And I moved into a one-bedroom apartment. I'll never forget how sad it was. I had an inflatable mattress for a bed. I had the couch that she left behind and some dishes in the kitchen. And it was kind of that sad, really pathetic bachelor life. But I met my best friend Tito at that time. He lived on the second floor with his mom. And he met me at what was my absolute worst. I spent my nights and weekends drinking, and I met him, and I don't even know how many times Tito drugged me home. I thank God for him, because he anchored me in a moment that I needed him the most. But we're 2.5 years later. I'm a little bit more grounded. I've gotten my footing in my career. And we came to Florida, 4th of July, 2000. I'll never forget. Came down here to hang out for a few days. I fell in love, decided I wanted to move down here. And in October of 2000, I found a great job, paying me great money. They relocated me. NC School of Telecom did pay off. So I had got a great job. I moved to Tampa. And I was there for about 2 years. Unfortunately, we were all laid off 2 years after. But in those 2 years, made great enough connections that I was able to, move to Orlando. In 2002, and I moved in with one of the guys that I worked with in Tampa, and collecting unemployment, working odd jobs here and there. 2003, I get a job at AT&T. And AT&T was a catapult. AT&T Wireless was a catapult into reestablishing my telecom career here in Central Florida, or in Orlando, I should say. I happened to meet my wife in 2003, but she was in the middle of a divorce and we weren't able to be anything but friends, but we were able to forge a solid relationship after meeting during that time frame. In 2004, I was able to get involved back into telecom and slowly get my life back under me. Got with a great company that I worked for in Maitland and worked there for about 8-9 years. And during that time frame, my wife worked out her divorce. Her and I went our separate ways for a few years, but we maintained a relationship, and then we reconnected. When my wife and I reconnected and we started dating, that's when I really began to hear God call me, because it started with my mother. My mother fell in love with my wife probably about as quickly as I did. She loves my wife. And my mom always told me, if you're gonna do things, you have to do them right. You need to make God the center of your relationship. And I remember that in 2009, we started attending Faith Assembly. And that's when I rekindled my relationship with God. And I remember that, we had a conversation about making God the center of our relationship and our life going forward. So with that in mind, it began to set off a series of events in my life that called me to a level of accountability and ownership that I wasn't exactly ready for. But when God's calling you to something, He's requiring something as well of you, which is sacrifice. And I wasn't making that sacrifice. We were dating, we were going to church, but we were still, going to clubs, and we were still doing things here and there. So New Year's Eve 2009, we decided to go out to celebrate New Year's Eve. We go to a club at somewhere downtown Orlando, I can't recall. New Year's Day, that morning, we were coming home. It's probably 3 o'clock in the morning. And we're not too far from where my wife and I currently live right now, just a few miles from where we live right now. And I remember we're sitting at an intersection, and my wife says, "Oh, you can turn right." And I said, "No, we're fine. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. There's no one here. It's just us. We're just talking. We weren't married yet. We're just dating." But I said, "There's no one here." Not minutes later, a car slams into us, probably at 50 plus miles an hour. And the car goes underneath us, lifts the truck, and takes it through the intersection. I'd been drinking, my wife's been drinking, and as we find out, clearly the guy behind us was drinking. It was a horrible night. During the investigation, I get into a shouting match with the guy. It just wasn't good. And there was no reason that I should have ever gotten in trouble that night, but I did. And they took me in that night, and I ended up spending the night in jail with the guy that had just rear-ended us. Probably one of the worst nights of my life. I had to sit there and listen to him for hours and hours and hours, try to talk to me and apologize, and the cops wouldn't do anything. I'm just sitting there in cuffs for hours listening to him. And all I remember was hearing in my voice, "Son, you had a choice. Son, you had a choice." And I still wasn't hearing it. I had a choice, but I still wasn't hearing it. For the next 10 months, I had to fight for my life. They wanted to absolutely destroy me. Mind you, when they took me in, I wasn't sitting in the car. They were investigating the accident. And I remember asking the cops, "What's going to happen to him?" But because of my actions prior to asking that question, the shouting match, the interaction with the guy, all of that led me to that point, that asking that question was the last thing I needed to do. They just didn't want to hear it. So it took me 10 months to fight. They finally lowered the charges, cost me, $3,000 to $4,000. And one of the most embarrassing things I had to do was call my parents the day I got out and ask for help. It hurt, it was embarrassing, but I'm glad I did it because they were the best people to help me. No matter what had happened prior to that moment, anything that happened before that moment. At this point, my dad was a man of God, and it just was what needed to be done, and it worked out. But I still wasn't getting it. 10 months, fought for my life, fought for my license, fought for my dignity and my character and my integrity, but I still wasn't getting it. My wife and I got engaged in the fall of 2010, November 2010. So that's a highlight of 2010. But I was still heavily involved in sports. I was still doing a lot of things that kept me distracted from God. I was playing softball, soccer, practicing jujitsu. There's probably one more in there, I don't know. Maybe one more in there. Flag football, that's the one. Because that's the one that does me in. In the spring of 2011, I'm involved in all these sports. And I'm not quite yet committed to God the way that I should be. And in 2011, I tear my left Achilles for the first time. Because I still wasn't getting it. I didn't know it was a torn Achilles. My doctors didn't know it was a torn Achilles because I didn't see a foot and ankle specialist. I just saw my primary care, so they thought it was a hematoma. That's where we left it. In June, my wife and I get married. June 25th, we get married, and I'm hobbling around. I had 2 dances for my wedding, one with my mom, one with my wife, and I sat around most of the time because I was in so much pain. But I still wasn't getting it, and I don't know why. A couple of weeks after our wedding, I tear my Achilles for the second time. Just got up off the couch, I pivoted, and it tore again. I will never forget the agonizing scream that I had the first time that I tore it. That was loud enough. I was playing flag football at a massive complex, 4 games going on, and I stopped all 4. This scream was different because it was a second time. To feel it a second time is worse. So we end up at the emergency room, then we realize I've had a torn Achilles the entire time. We meet a foot and ankle doctor, he starts treating me, and I'm going through rehabilitation. But I guess I still wasn't getting it because I still wasn't committing to God. So in the spring of 2012, this is around February, I'm at work, and I take a wrong step, and I tear my Achilles for the 3rd time. So for a 3rd time, I tear my Achilles. At this point, my doctor looks at me, he goes, "Man, I can offer you 3 options. 3 options. There it is again. I can offer you 3 options, but you've only got one. Interestingly enough, now as I'm sharing this testimony, I really only had one option, and it wasn't the surgical option it wasn't that, it was God. That's what I needed. That was the one I needed, but I still wasn't getting it. And so I have my surgery because that was my only option to repair my physical leg. That was my only option. I don't know. I'm crutching around the apartment, I remember. And I don't even know how this happens because as crazy as it sounds me sharing it, it's crazy that it happened, but I didn't know I had a partially torn left ACL. So I tore my left Achilles. I didn't know I had a partially torn left ACL. But as I'm crutching around in the apartment one day, I trip up, I fall, and to protect my Achilles, I slam my knee into the floor, and there goes my ACL, ruptured. Man, I don't even know why I still wasn't getting it, but I still wasn't getting it. It was horrible. We lived on the third floor in a third floor apartment, and I'm picking myself up every day with my leg in the condition it was in. My body's ravaged. I'm in pain, and every day I'm picking myself up to this third floor. At this point, my wife and I decide that we need to move. So we moved to a house just across the street from the house that we currently own. First, one floor. And a couple of months after, I have my ACL surgery. So within a 6-month period, I have Achilles and ACL surgery. The amount of pain that I'm under, I wasn't taking my pain medication because it made me sick and it made me crazy. So I'm in agonizing pain every day, day after day. I'm by myself. I'm in recovery by myself. But I'll never forget, there was one moment where I couldn't even get to the bathroom. Do you know how much it sucks to have to go to the bathroom and you might not make it because you're in so much pain? You don't even want to get out of the bed because you know if you put your feet on the ground, it's going to hurt. And I was so broken. And I remember I'm begging God for answers. And the only thing that God says to me is, son, you weren't listening. This was the only way to get you on. I had to put you on your back to get you to look up to me and to turn to me. So I had to sit there for the next few months as God worked on my soul and my spirit. But in the fall of 2012, that's when I finally made a decision. We had an event at the church, and it was a connecting point event where you can go and connect with different groups. And I drug my broken body. I remember I was in some sort of contraption wrapped around my leg to keep it intact. It was probably from my thigh to my ankle. I wore so many, but I drug my body to Faith Assembly that day, I remember, and I met this group of men that were so instrumental in the beginning of my spiritual recovery. My physical recovery is still underway, but that was the beginning of my spiritual recovery, was in the fall of 2012. From there is when God took off with me. I became a small group leader. I was leading groups at 2 different churches, but my wife and I were still going through these challenges in our own home. God was working out all these things within me, but it was time to address my home. And I'm part of a blended family. I have a stepdaughter who I've never called stepdaughter. She is my daughter. I've been with her since she was 6 years old. And through this spiritual journey of healing is when God really showed me what it is to be a husband, what it is to be a father, because I didn't get that chance with my daughter, but I got that chance with my second daughter. And He gave me opportunities that I thought I wouldn't have. So when you hear that God will return that void, He'll return that void, and it doesn't always come in the way that you think or the way that you need. And I'm forever indebted to God for those moments. He allowed me to be a father and now a husband, and He's showing me how to be a husband, how to operate in this space. And it took years. It's not something that's easy to do. But I learned what it meant to die to myself. I'm learning what it means to be there for other people, for my wife, my daughter, my family. And it's a process that is a work in progress. But I'm thankful because salvation is what's brought me to this point. Had I never made that decision in 2012 to drag my broken body to Faith Assembly, and I remember talking to my wife about it and saying, I gotta be there. I have to be there. I need to go. I don't remember why, because the men that I was with, I have zero in common with, except for God, but that's just how God is, because I'm thinking I need to find a bunch of rough and tough guys that love sports. No, I needed to find a bunch of rough and tough guys that love God. I had it all wrong. But that decision alone, the decision to just pick myself up and to get in there and allow God to really begin to work on me. That iron sharpening iron, as much as you hear it, is not cliche at all. You know, this last decade, as much as I've struggled with some of my health issues, what God has done through it is probably the thing that I'm the most thankful for. It's the thing that's the most instrumental in where I'm at now. Went on my first missions trip. That was something I would have never envisioned 2 years ago, let alone 6 months ago, because just in January, I wasn't even moving. But that's how good God is. Through that perseverance, through that constant searching, through the constant seeking, God is still working through me. He's working to heal my spiritual side, my soul, and my body. And I'm thankful. So as far as my first mission trip is concerned, you know, I didn't know where God was going to take me in this new season. And, you know, we've all experienced the 2020 season of COVID, and a lot of us, you know, or most of us, if not all of us, have hunkered down to really find out what the next step is. Job loss, you know, income loss, all these different things that we've lost, and myself included. But one of the things that I mainly lost throughout that time was that sense of community and connecting. And there were no small groups any longer. Everything had ended. So where do we go from here? And I'm thankful, you know, through One Love Ministries that I was able to connect with them and to be able to rebuild my identity that was lost in 2020. I've been able to do it with the Kings, who are Lydia and Gregor, fantastic. Dennis behind the camera, the rest of the One Love team, my wife especially, because we've been locked up in the house with each other. But it led to this mission trip. And my first mission trip, I was scared. I wasn't sure how my body was going to hold up. My body's failed me a lot in the last 10 years. My mind hasn't, my heart hasn't, but my body has. But I wasn't sure how I was going to hold up. And I'm going on the mission trips to Puerto Rico for the first time, and I'm not going to see my family, which was another hurdle. That was a big, massive hurdle, because I knew God had me there for something different. And I knew he was separating me, but I did not know how. And what he did in me in that time, and we're still in the middle of it, was incredible. I asked God, I said, God, I want to find my voice. I want to find my place. He's allowed me to find my voice. I'm sharing my testimony, something I would have never thought I would be doing, and I'm freely sharing it at that. That was how meeting stranger friends, as Greg and I would say, meeting strangers in Puerto Rico, which really are just family, just reconnecting with the island and connecting with the artists and connecting with the people of Puerto Rico in a different way. We went to the mountains, went to coffee farms. We went to places that people just don't go. And I saw the island in a different way, and I saw my people in a different way, and I saw where I'm from. I was able to connect with that in a different way. And it just was a profound experience. I'm forever changed. I mean, God showed me that I can trust my body. He showed me that I can overcome heights. I crossed this bridge that was crazy. I don't even know what I was doing crossing that bridge, but God sent this random woman to just speak life into me. And she walks up to me with this neck brace on. This was probably one of the most important times, but she walks up to me, she's coming off the bridge, and she overhears me say that I can't do it. And I turn around to go walk away, and she stops me. And she says, hey, I just fell from 15 feet. I fractured 2 vertebrae in my neck. She said, my faith in God is what's brought me to this point. She says, so I know if I have that faith to do it, you can do it too. You just have to trust God. I was flabbergasted. I didn't even know what to think. I'm looking around. Everyone's just looking at me, and I turn around and she's walking away. She was done. That's all she had for me. That's all God sent her to say to me. And I looked at the bridge and I looked at my friends. The bridge cost $1 to get across that bridge. I looked in my pocket, I had exactly $1. And I said, all right, well, we're gonna cross that bridge then. So we walked across and we crossed that beautiful bridge. It's a beautiful sight, it's a beautiful bridge, and I hope you guys, I'll share pictures of it on my Instagram later so you guys can see the bridge that I crossed and kind of relive that moment with me. But God is good. You know, if you seek him, if you ask, if you knock, it's cliche, but it's really not, because it's written. He'll answer. It's not going to be in the way you think, because it wasn't in the way that I thought. You know, I'm weird about people just walking up to me, but he sent this beautiful woman to just walk up to me and share that story with me, to get me motivated to know that God is real and that he's still here, and he still answers your prayers, and he still answers your questions, and he still comforts you in those moments of distress. So I just encourage you guys to keep digging in, to keep asking, to keep seeking, to keep knocking. I thank you for taking this moment and to listen to my story, to listen to my testimony. There's so much more of it, and one day I'll share other parts of it when God calls me to it. So I've revealed so much of it. And I ask that you follow our missions, follow our stories, Adventures in One Love. Follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, follow us everywhere. Follow us on our journey, follow me on my journey of discovery in Puerto Rico, in the Caribbean, wherever I might go. And just remember that it starts with one, and it starts with you.